What's up guys, this video is the basics of how a camera works, so if you want to know your first steps, this is the most important video you can watch. We're going to go over the basics of the shutter speed, the aperture and ISO, what they are, what they do and how you can use them. The absolute basics, these three things control the exposure of the camera. Thankfully the cameras do most of it for you, but if you just want to get your head around it and get a little bit fancy with your photos, this video is for you. Let's just start off with the easiest one that personally I rarely touch. The ISO. It's essentially how sensitive your camera is to light. In all situations you want to try and keep that ISO as low as possible, because the higher you go with it, the more grain or noise is introduced to your photo and just dropping the quality of it. Here's an example comparison. So here's a photo I took at 100 ISO. You can see crisp, quality, gorgeous. Here's one that I took at the maximum my camera would let me, which is 12,800. You can see that the grain and noise has ruined the quality of the photo. The only time you want to go high with your ISO is when you're in a dark environment, for example at the evening at a wedding, or just at night time really. You can let that ISO go high enough to compensate for how dark it is. Thankfully with most cameras you can set a limit, so personally I never go above 3200. And by setting that range of 100 ISO to 3200 ISO, I can just leave on auto and let the camera do its thing. Because I feel anything above 3200 on my camera is when you're really going to notice it and you're going to lose the quality and you're going to struggle to get it back in editing. Next up, let's talk about the shutter speed. This is where you can start getting really creative. So what is the shutter speed? The shutter speed is the speed the shutter goes at. They've named it very well. Now what happens with the shutter is it opens up, it closes and lets in enough light to the sensor to essentially expose your photo. So by comparison you can see with a slower shutter speed that the more light will get into the photo. The downside to having a slow shutter speed is then you're going to have motion blur. I say downside because you might want it intentionally. Here's a photo I took at fast shutter speed and you can see that everyone in focus, sharp, gorgeous. Here's one at a slightly slower shutter speed where we can start creating movement. Now unintentionally you are going to notice the camera shake and it's not nice, but in this photo I deliberately wanted the people movement to show that the street was busy. But the majority of the time, personally I shoot at 125th at the slowest. Any slower than that you can start to see camera shake when you're holding the camera moving about. And what's great about that is again on my camera I can set the limit between 125th of a second and 8000. So I can just rely on the camera to pick the shutter speed between 125th of a second and an 8000th of a second, and I can then manually change it if I do want to do something a bit more fancy. For example, the motion blur, a panning shot, you name it. And then finally, the aperture. The aperture is just this little circle thing that opens up and closes like the eye. So if you were to close your eyes, you're letting less light in. You open your eyes bright, lots of light. It's why on a sunny day you tend to squint your eyes a bit more to let less light in. That's what a camera's doing. Now your aperture depends on your lens. Basic kit ones will start about f4, but most prime lenses, the ones that I like to use, I can get down to 1.4. What's the advantage of that? Well, good question. If you open your aperture as much as possible, you're letting as much light as possible. Fantastic. And just like the ISO, if you change it to become more sensitive to light, you also introduce grain, and with the shutter speed, when you slow it down to introduce more light, you do start to have movement. And just like the aperture, when you open it and close it, it does have a secondary effect rather than just controlling light. It has depth of field. Depth of field is that sexy thing where everything's out of focus in the background. Bokeh. Kind of like golf, it goes backwards. So the higher the number, the more closed it is. The lower the number, the more open it is. So for example, when I shoot at 1.4, the aperture is going to be wide open. If I shoot at an f22, the aperture is going to be very closed. And just to add in, if you've ever seen someone use the term f, 1.4, f4, f8, f22, the f just means the f-stop and is related to what aperture is at. That's why you'll see most lenses have an f next to it, and then it's got a number following. It's the aperture. Right, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a wide open and a closed ISO? Well, if I wanted to shoot an f22, meaning that the aperture is just like this, I am letting in very little light. But if I was to have this candle in the foreground and then a beautiful backdrop, not here, I don't live in a beautiful street I'm afraid, it would mean that both of these things are in focus. But if I was to do this at 1.4, and with that, this would be completely in focus, and to be honest, I would be out of focus. And here's an example of me on Victoria Terrace. I want these street pole things to be out of focus. If I shoot at an f/22, you can see here, everything's perfectly in focus. If the fact that I do want it out of focus, I'm going to drop that aperture way down. Aperture is wide open, and then you can see lovely out of focus, the street in focus. And you can tell with both photos, if you look at the shutter speed and the ISO, they are greatly different. As you can see, at f/22, the aperture is almost closed, but that has meant that the shutter speed has to compensate and become a lot slower to let in more light, because the aperture is closed, not letting a lot of light, so the shutter speed slows down. Whilst on the opposite end, at the 1.4, there's a lot of light getting through that aperture. That means the shutter speed can go so much faster. Hopefully that has made sense to you guys, but just to quickly recap, shutter speed, the faster it goes, the more sharp your photos. The slower it goes, the more blurred. There are artistic points to both. Like I say, I've customized my camera not to drop between 125th of a second and 8,000. It stays within that. I'm not going to get any motion blur. If I want it, I'll go to manual and I'll do it myself. The ISO, again, there's no real advantage of going higher, apart from to let in a little bit more light. Ideally, you want to keep it as low as possible without underexposing your photos. And that's why I have the ISO at range of 100 to 3200, and I will not let my camera go any higher. And thirdly, the aperture. I just love that sexy bokeh in photos, so I like to tend to shoot between the 1.4 and the 4. My main focus is the aperture, and that's why I shoot an aperture priority. Because if I've set a limit for the ISO and I've set the limit for the shutter speed, I don't care what happens with these. It means that if I choose the aperture, the camera will pick the best ISO and shutter speed. I will happily go into more of these settings if you want me to in a different video, but I just want to keep this simple, straightforward. Hopefully it makes sense. Essentially, the more you get off auto, the more you understand how your camera works, you can just get so much more creative and just do a whole range of photography. Just have fun with it, you know? If there's anything else you want to know, just comment down below and I'll do my best.